The story begins in an unassuming suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where lawns are trimmed every Saturday, cars are washed religiously, and neighbors wave at each other while secretly peeking over hedges to see if anyone's grass is greener. On the surface, it looked idyllic. Quiet streets, children riding bikes, and tidy homes that all seemed cut from the same brochure. But beneath that veneer of suburban perfection, tension simmered, and it all started with a single tree. The homeowner, whose property sat on a corner lot, had inherited the tree when he bought the house years earlier. It was an old oak, its trunk wide and sturdy, its branches stretching like arms that shaded half the yard and spilled gently over the fence line. In spring, it bloomed with green vitality. In autumn, it painted the ground in gold. It was the kind of tree that anchored a yard, the kind that made a property feel timeless and established. But not everyone saw it that way. Next door lived a woman who had earned, through both her attitude and her actions, the nickname that fit her best, Karen. From the very beginning, she was determined to make the tree her enemy. She saw the shade as an inconvenience, the falling leaves as an insult, the roots as a threat. And in typical fashion, she made it her mission not only to complain, but to try to erase the tree from existence altogether. At first, the conflict was small. She would sigh loudly while raking leaves, drag bags of debris out to the curb while glaring, and make passive-aggressive comments about how some people didn't respect their neighbors. But soon, those sighs turned into written notes and the notes into formal complaints. Before long, the local HOA, the homeowners association that loomed over every minor dispute, was pulled into the matter. The HOA, of course, thrived on complaints like these. It was their bread and butter, their reason for existing. And when Karen began her campaign to have the tree removed, they listened carefully. She claimed the roots were encroaching on her property, threatening to damage her driveway. She said the falling branches were a hazard. She even argued that the tree was an eyesore, though anyone else with eyes could see it was the most beautiful feature on the street. The homeowner pushed back gently at first. He had inspected the roots, which remained well within his property line. He had trimmed any overhanging branches. He kept the tree neat, well-maintained, and clearly within legal requirements. But Karen wasn't satisfied. She wanted the tree gone, and she was willing to escalate the fight until she got her way. The HOA issued warning letters. They threatened fines. Each time the homeowner responded with evidence, photographs, and even the opinion of a certified arborist who confirmed the tree was healthy and not causing damage. But none of that mattered to Karen, because for her this was never really about the tree. It was about control. She wanted dominance over the neighborhood, and this tree represented defiance she couldn't tolerate. The battle dragged on for months. Neighbors began to whisper about it, taking sides in hushed conversations. Some thought the homeowner should just cut it down and be done with it. Others admired his resolve in standing his ground. The tree became a symbol, a line drawn in the sand, and the drama that surrounded it only grew louder. Eventually, Karen decided she had only one option left: to take the matter to court. She filed a civil complaint, claiming the tree was encroaching on her property and causing damage. She argued that she had a right to have it removed, and she demanded not only that it be cut down, but also that the homeowner pay for damages she insisted the tree had caused. When the court summons arrived, it was both infuriating and absurd. The idea that something as simple and natural as a tree could escalate to a legal battle was almost laughable. But that was the reality of life with Karen next door. And so, what had begun as petty neighborhood drama now became a full-blown legal dispute. The homeowner gathered evidence meticulously. He photographed the base of the tree, the property lines clearly marked by survey stakes. He hired a land surveyor to double-check the boundaries, ensuring there could be no doubt about whose land the tree occupied. He brought in the arborist once again to provide testimony about the tree's health. Every document was stacked neatly in a folder, every angle covered. Karen, meanwhile, prepared her own case. She collected photos of leaves in her yard, cracks in her driveway that she insisted were caused by roots, and testimony from her friends who echoed her complaints. She strutted into the courthouse, certain of victory, convinced that the judge would see things her way, and finally deliver the punishment she believed her neighbor deserved. But the law is not always so easily bent to entitlement. The first court date was tense, with both sides presenting their arguments. Karen was fiery, her complaints spilling out in a flood of exaggerated claims. She painted herself as the victim, a homeowner plagued by a reckless neighbor's negligence. The homeowner, by contrast, remained calm, presenting his evidence with precision and clarity. He didn't need theatrics, he had facts. The judge listened patiently, weighing the evidence. At first it seemed like a straightforward case. Was the tree a nuisance or wasn't it? But as the property surveys and boundary maps were presented, something unexpected surfaced. The surveyor's findings didn't just confirm that the tree was firmly on the homeowner's property, it revealed something far more significant. The property line between the two homes had been misinterpreted for years. Fences had been placed slightly off from the official markers, and what everyone, including Karen, had believed was part of her yard was, in fact, not hers at all. The maps and records showed clearly that a section of what she had maintained, landscaped and claimed as her own was legally on the homeowner's side. It was a revelation that shifted the entire case. The judge, surprised by the evidence, paused the proceedings to review everything carefully. What had started as a battle over one tree was suddenly about property rights and land ownership. The irony was striking. In trying to use the law to force her neighbor to cut down his tree, Karen had inadvertently opened the door to losing part of her own yard. The court session ended without a final ruling that day, but the tone had shifted. The homeowner left with quiet confidence, knowing the tide was turning. Karen stormed out, rattled and furious, but unwilling to accept that the ground beneath her, literally, might not belong to her at all. The neighborhood buzzed with the news. Whispers spread quickly, as they always did, and soon everyone knew what had happened in court. The woman who had tried to control everything was suddenly facing the possibility of losing control of the one thing she valued most, her property. And so what began as a petty feud over a tree was now evolving into something much bigger, something no one could have predicted. The battle wasn't over, it was only just beginning. The weeks following the first hearing were tense, drawn out, and filled with simmering resentment that seemed to spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. The tree stood tall and unchanged, its thick roots gripping the soil with an ancient authority that no court order had yet stripped away. But the woman next door, the neighbor whose discontent had sparked the entire saga, was not satisfied with leaving the battle unfinished. She escalated her campaign, dragging the dispute into increasingly dramatic arenas, convinced that her persistence alone would eventually topple both the tree and her adversary. From the outside, the situation looked absurd to those who were not directly involved. Neighbors whispered about it during evening strolls, couples paused at the curb to speculate on what might happen next, and children treated the tree like a stage set in some community drama, pointing at it with wide-eyed curiosity, as if it were a monument to conflict. But inside the homes of the two feuding property owners, the tension was anything but amusing. The woman, fueled by anger and an exaggerated sense of righteousness, began documenting every falling leaf, every stray branch, and every bird that nested in the tree's wide canopy. She built a narrative around imagined dangers, claims of property damage, threats to safety, and violations of HOA landscaping codes. It was as though she had appointed herself the arbiter of neighborhood aesthetics, positioning herself against the tree as though it were some kind of looming villain. Her determination hardened into obsession, and she soon filed additional complaints, dragging the matter back into court once again. This second round of legal wrangling was far more dramatic than the first. Lawyers came armed with surveys, photos, historical records of property lines, and environmental assessments of the tree. The courtroom became a stage where every minor detail of suburban life was amplified into a matter of civic consequence. The judge listened with weary patience as the woman's team argued that the tree not only encroached on her peace, but also technically stood in violation of boundaries she claimed had been drawn incorrectly decades earlier. Her argument was bold. Not only should the tree be cut down, but the land it stood upon should be declared hers. But beneath the legal maneuvers, a different story was quietly unraveling. Property maps, some older than the subdivision itself, revealed inconsistencies that had been overlooked for years. Surveyors, called in as expert witnesses, brought forward diagrams that showed subtle shifts in where the property lines were drawn, compared to where fences and yards now stood. The more closely the evidence was examined, the clearer it became that the woman had not only misunderstood the boundaries, she had been benefiting from land that technically was not hers. The irony deepened with each revelation. What began as her attempt to gain power over her neighbor's tree began to expose uncomfortable truths about her own yard. It turned out that the very patch of land where she had planted flowers, built decorative edging, and even extended her patio furniture was not hers at all. Quiet murmurs rippled through the courtroom as these findings came to light. What she thought was the high ground from which she would strike down her opponent was, in fact, shaky soil upon which she had built without right. Back at home, the neighborhood continued to buzz with speculation. Some residents were sympathetic to the woman, insisting that the boundaries were confusing and that anyone could have made the same mistake. Others shook their heads, noting how aggressively she had pursued her neighbor and how poetic it was that her determination to win at any cost might soon cost her more than she could have imagined. For the tree's owner, there was a strange mixture of emotions. Relief came in knowing that the truth was surfacing, but unease lingered as the drama stretched on. It was not simply about the tree anymore. It was about principles, fairness, and the unforeseen consequences of pushing a fight too far. Every court appearance, every legal bill, every rumor that circulated through the neighborhood added to the weight of the situation. The entire affair began to feel less like a dispute over landscaping and more like a turning point in how the community defined itself. The judge, sensing the broader implications, delayed ruling until further surveys could be completed. This decision left both parties in limbo. The woman fumed at what she saw as unnecessary stalling, her frustration spilling out into loud conversations on her porch and thinly veiled remarks directed toward anyone within earshot. The tree's owner, by contrast, adopted a quieter stance, knowing that patience was now an ally. The longer the process played out, the clearer the truth became. Meanwhile, the tree remained as it always had, its leaves rustling in the wind, its branches swaying under the weight of passing seasons. To the children who still played beneath it, the tree seemed eternal, untouchable, and strangely wise. To the adults embroiled in the conflict, however, it had become a symbol of stubborn endurance, representing both the resilience of nature and the unyielding realities of property law. Weeks turned into months as surveyors returned with their final measurements. The conclusion was undeniable. The woman had overstepped. The boundary line placed a significant portion of what she claimed as her yard firmly within her neighbor's property. It was a revelation that turned her crusade into a self-inflicted wound. Her demand to have the tree removed was now overshadowed by the reality that she had been encroaching all along. The announcement of this finding spread quickly through the neighborhood. Conversations that once revolved around whether the tree should stay or go now shifted to hushed speculation about what the final ruling would mean for the woman's yard. Would she lose her carefully manicured flower beds? Would the fence need to be moved? Would the patio furniture she proudly displayed each summer be forced back onto a much smaller patch of land? The tension thickened as the date for the judge's final ruling drew near. The woman grew increasingly defensive, patrolling her yard with a kind of desperate vigilance, as though watching over a kingdom that might soon be taken from her. Her once confident demeanor gave way to visible anxiety, and even her allies in the HOA began to distance themselves, wary of being associated with what was rapidly becoming a public spectacle of stubbornness gone wrong. When the courtroom filled once more, anticipation hung heavy in the air. Neighbors, curious residents, and even local reporters slipped into seats to witness what had now become a widely discussed case. The woman, still clinging to her narrative, tried to argue that the surveys were flawed, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. The judge, with steady authority, prepared to deliver a decision that would not only settle the dispute, but reshape the boundaries of both properties forever. And with that moment looming, the story stood on the edge of transformation. What began as an attempt to remove a tree had spiraled into a situation where land, pride, and reputation were all on the line. The gavel had not yet fallen, but the air was heavy with the inevitability of consequences. The break in the drama came naturally at this point. The courtroom hushed, the tension reached its peak, and the decision was about to be read. The courtroom ruling had been delivered, and the neighborhood was buzzing with disbelief. The Karen who had demanded that a harmless tree be cut down now stood stripped of a portion of her own property. The judge's decision had not only protected the tree, but redrawn the property boundaries, handing over part of Karen's manicured yard to the very neighbor she had tried to undermine. The news spread quickly through the cul-de-sac. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones, amused and astonished by the irony. For years, Karen had built her reputation on strict control, patrolling lawns for weeds, measuring fence heights, reporting trash bins left out too long, and nitpicking every minor infraction. She thrived on conflict, convinced it was her duty to enforce rules that no one had asked her to enforce. Yet now her obsession had backfired spectacularly, and the balance of power in the community had shifted. The transformation began subtly. Where Karen's yard once extended proudly with a perfect green carpet and a row of decorative shrubs, surveyors now marked a new boundary. Stakes were driven into the ground, connected by bright orange tape, cutting through her prized landscaping. Neighbors watched from porches as her expression hardened, her face frozen in disbelief as reality set in. The tape didn't just represent land lost, it represented a permanent reminder of her defeat, an open wound she couldn't cover with excuses. For the homeowner who had fought so long to defend the tree, the shift was liberating. The battle had been draining, filled with paperwork, hearings, sleepless nights, and the stress of being targeted. But the ruling offered not just vindication, it offered expansion. Suddenly the yard was larger, the tree stood safer than ever, and the new space opened possibilities that Karen could no longer control. Where Karen once hovered, issuing demands, now she stood helpless as ownership slipped from her grasp. The weeks following the ruling turned into a showcase of transformation. The homeowner moved quickly to establish the new boundaries, installing a tasteful wooden fence that curved neatly along the freshly marked line. Every hammer strike echoed through the neighborhood like punctuation on the final judgment. Karen watched from her windows, her arms crossed tightly, her expression sour. Where her shrubs once stood proudly, now fence posts rose like sentinels closing her out. She had tried to remove the tree, and in return, she lost part of her yard to a wall she couldn't cross. But it wasn't just about physical land, it was about presence. The homeowner treated the expansion as a canvas. The reclaimed strip of property became a flourishing garden, carefully tended with vibrant flowers, herbs, and climbing vines that wrapped around trellises. The space radiated life, attracting butterflies and bees, becoming a place of peace and beauty. Neighbors admired the change, some even walking over to compliment the effort, noting how the area had once been sterile under Karen's control, but now blossomed with charm. Karen, however, could not escape the humiliation. Her once perfect symmetry was broken. Her hedges abruptly ended at the new boundary, looking awkward and incomplete. Her yard felt smaller, and every morning she awoke to the sight of the fence reminding her of the decision she couldn't overturn. She tried to pretend nothing had changed, continuing her patrols and nitpicking about garbage bins and parking spots, but the authority she once carried was gone. The ruling had branded her not as an enforcer of order, but as a cautionary tale of excess. Resentment brewed within her, but her options were limited. She had exhausted her appeals, spent thousands on legal fees, and stood publicly defeated. The neighborhood knew it. Her reputation, once built on fear and persistence, was shattered. People who had once reluctantly complied with her demands no longer felt pressured. They trimmed their lawns when they wanted, painted their fences the colors they liked, and no longer braced themselves for Karen's glare. Without her yard as her fortress, without the leverage of intimidation, she was simply another resident, one whose downfall had been broadcast in spectacular fashion. The homeowner, meanwhile, leaned into the victory with quiet confidence. Rather than gloating, they allowed the transformation of the property to speak for itself. The tree at the center of the conflict grew stronger each season, its branches spreading wider as if reclaiming space in solidarity. Children played under its shade, neighbors admired its resilience, and it became a symbol of balance, a reminder that persistence against pettiness could yield triumph. Karen tried small acts of resistance. She planted thorny bushes along the inside of her new fence line, hoping to reclaim some sense of control. She complained to anyone who would listen about the unfairness of the ruling, spinning stories that painted her as the victim. But the more she spoke, the less sympathy she found. People remembered her constant intrusions, her endless complaints, her threats of legal action over minor issues. They remembered how she had escalated a disagreement about a tree into a full-blown court battle. And they remembered how spectacularly she had lost. Her bitterness only deepened as she realized her social standing was collapsing. Invitations to neighborhood gatherings dwindled, friendly waves turned into cold nods. Parents warned their children not to bother her yard. She became isolated, left with little more than her resentment and a shrinking plot of land that no longer represented the status she had once flaunted. But life moved on for the rest of the community. The homeowner's expanded yard became a hub of activity, filled with barbecues, small gatherings, and the laughter of children. Where Karen's property line had once imposed a rigid border, there was now openness and warmth. The irony was clear to everyone. The very tree she had tried to destroy had brought the neighborhood closer together, while her obsession had pushed her further into isolation. As the months passed, Karen's influence withered completely. Her efforts to start new conflicts fizzled, her letters to the HOA went unanswered, and her complaints at town meetings were met with polite dismissal. She had become a ghost of her former self, a reminder of what happened when control turned into obsession. The homeowner, on the other hand, thrived. The garden flourished, the yard expanded with new features, and the property became one of the most admired in the community. It wasn't just about land. It was about peace, freedom, and the satisfaction of standing firm against unnecessary aggression. In the end, the story of Karen and the tree became a neighborhood legend. It was retold with chuckles at barbecues, whispered with knowing smiles at community events, and passed on to newcomers as a lesson. The tale always carried the same message. Sometimes the harder someone tries to take away from others, the more they lose themselves. Karen had wanted a tree gone, but instead she lost her yard, her reputation, and her influence. The homeowner had fought not just for their property, but for fairness, and in the end, they gained far more than land. They gained peace, community, and the satisfaction of watching justice grow stronger with each branch of the tree that had stood against Karen's storm. The story closed not with bitterness, but with balance. The tree remained rooted deep and unshaken, its leaves whispering in the breeze like a quiet victory song. The garden thrived around it, neighbors enjoyed its presence, and Karen's once commanding glare had faded into irrelevance. And so what began as a battle over a tree ended as a transformation of an entire community. The tree had not only survived, it had changed everything around it. And in its shadow, the lesson remained clear. When pettiness meets persistence, the roots of fairness run deep and justice always finds a way to grow.